Thank you so much. This is Akhilesh Agarwal, and I'll be talking about what we do here at Apex along with the project implementation for AT&T and how they use the Apex portal. So just a little background about Apex. We are more than 30-year-old company. We have a broad range of solutions, including recovery audit services, as well as a number of different technology solutions. Today, our focus is going to be on Apex portal as well as Smart VM and how it is being used by AT&T. Just an overview of Apex portal. It is a 100% touchless supplier information management and risk management solution. It integrates very nicely with Smart VM, which is a global repository of 55 million plus suppliers worldwide. We have golden records for it. And we validate supply information like tax IDs, bank account numbers, addresses, minority and diversity information through more than 850 external data sources, and the list is growing. So having said that, at this point, I would like to invite Ken to talk a bit about AT&T.
Hi, this is Ken Reatherford. So AT&T is a 150-ish year old company. We mainly now are mobile cellular company is our main target at the moment. We've gathered companies and we've sold companies, and it's been kind of a roller coaster. But so at AT&T, so like the bio said, I'm in charge of our global accounts payable. I have teams across the globe that handle all of our payments to suppliers. Any payment out the door, except for mergers and acquisitions, comes through my team. We also manage the vendor master for all of AT&T, as well as we have the expense system and review process. So one thing that we wanted to do is to automate our vendor process, which I think we'll get into here in just a minute. So a little bit about AT&T. So today, I'll explain how we do it. We are a customer of apexanalytix. However, we are not live with our solution yet. So today we have what we call a homegrown supplier web tool. So the business unit, we have 70 plus business units. They go out to our suppliers that they want to do business with. They gather all the information, the W-9 or a W-8 if it's foreign, etc., and provide that. They type that into our homegrown web tool. We then have manual validations before and after they're put into the vendor master, both that we handle at AT&T. So our vendor base gets audited every year, internally as well as externally. So it's one thing that we have tightened controls over the years with. Unfortunately, though, it's still not immune to fraud. So we have experienced fraud. Mostly it's because our suppliers were hacked, sent us an email, totally looked legitimate, and then the money went to the hacker instead of the supplier. So we, not only is our homegrown web tool kind of archaic, if you will, it's not streamlined, there's no automation in that, and it still has gaps in the process that can allow fraud. So we partner, two of my biggest business units are global real estate and global supply chain. AT&T is not a procure to pay company. However, global supply chain makes up about 30% of our spend. We have over about 120,000 vendors and sites, if you will. And supply chain is about 15 to 18,000 of those. Global real estate is about 15,000 suppliers as well. Both of these business units have special needs. The remaining business units are a little more hands-off, if you will. So vendor information is a little streamlined. Global real estate and global supply chain both have specific and additional needs as well as data that they want to carry along with the vendor. We do have 5 different procurement systems that we work with across AT&T, both domestic and international, that global real estate and global supply chain both utilize. So there's a lot of specific needs for them. So we partner with them on a daily basis with when it comes to our vendor master. So the reason that I chose Apex is to help us not only automate our vendor master process, but is to help us also prevent fraud. So today, like I said, our business units have to gather the information and from the supplier, and they have to enter it in manually into a tool, which we then store that information and use it for our checks. A lot of our data checks and balances, if you will, some of them are before, but some of them are after the fact. So using Apex is helping us to streamline and automate our process and helping us to prevent fraud. So when I was looking for a solution, it needed to be an enterprise-wide solution, right? Across the board, the entire vendor master for AT&T. We needed to reduce all of the manual efforts, not only on my team, but as well as each business unit. We needed, most definitely, the highest one is we needed automated compliance. That is my number one priority, is automated compliance. And then, of course, I have 70 plus business units that use our vendor master, so I need them to be happy as well. So choosing a portal helps to reduce their workload as well. So the way this works with Apex, and I did choose Apex after I looked at 4 different solutions. Apex was by far the most, offered the most compliance as well as automation for me. So my business units now will then request an invite to the supplier by sending an email out through the portal, and for them to register. The supplier then completes all the information. They put in their tax ID, it checks it real time, it creates the W-9 for them. There's no need for them to upload anything. It also checks their addresses and all of the third-party sources, OFAC, all of the compliance happens when the supplier is completing that registration real time. So those real-time validations are very important so that we can't put inaccurate information into our vendor master. So the approval process is based on which type of supplier it is. So global supply chain and corporate real estate both have their own approval process, as well as our international global supply chain as well. So the reason I set that up is so that they can monitor those additional data fields that they want. So it also it helps me with compliance. So today, in order to set up a vendor in our vendor master, we require auditing, I should say, our auditing requires proof of doing business with that supplier. I need a copy of a contract. I need a copy of an invoice. I need a legal settlement, or I need a customer refund bill or something. I need to show documentation why we need to set them up as a vendor. So going forward with Apex, I no longer have to require that information up front, because not only does the requester, when they send that invite to the supplier, that routes to their boss for approval, and then they get to review the data on the back end through this approval process. And then once that happens, if it's not approved, it can go back to the supplier for additional information. But once it is approved, it can come into my ERP system, and then we send that vendor master data to many of our not all 70 plus of our feeder systems, but many of them get active supplier information. So that helps me make sure that the vendor master data is complete as well as accurate. And the best part about it is domestically that checks the bank account, the routing number bank account, that it belongs to the owner of that supplier. So it helps me prevent fraud as well. So the online real-time validation is very important. So right now we have, so with Apex, there's different modules, right? The registration module obviously is the most important. But Apex also has a discovery module, a risk assessment module, and an inquiry module that we are incorporating into our portal. So we'll have all four of the, actually I think there's a couple more, but we'll have those four in our portal. So we have our supplier inquiry module live. It's live dark at the moment because we're working on our registration module. We're scheduled to go live here in just a few months. So there's a lot of complex requirements with AT&T, especially with a couple of business units that I mentioned. So adding data fields and approvals and routing and all this. So we also route for terms, right? For payment terms. So we have a lot of complex requirements. So it's just taking us a little while to get it built. However, we are progressing and very happy where we stand. So.
Thank you, Ken, for your story so far. As Ken mentioned, fraud is typically tied to the vendors getting paid and getting paid incorrectly. Instead of going to the right bank account, it goes to a fraudster's bank account. I want to share a story with some examples on how a typical bank fraud happens. And this is an example from a real life incident where there was potential fraud, and Apex was fortunately able to prevent that fraud from happening. So you can see on the screen, here's an image of a letter uh, for ACH transfers provided by a supplier. The supplier's email account was hacked. An imposter had taken over the supplier's email as well as their parts of their network and was communicating with a client by putting together this ACH document requesting a bank account change. What you will notice is a series of issues which such artifacts that you may get via email or within another supplier portal in the market. So the first one is, if you look at this document closely, it's formatting inconsistencies, which are very obvious if we take a close look at it, right? The text is misaligned on the attention line. Date is not even in the US format for a US supplier. The bank logo is off the center and inconsistent capitals and punctuations and so on and so forth, right? So we have taken that real life document. Obviously, for privacy reasons, we have modified it to a fictitious bank, but this is from a real life scenario, right? So whenever someone who does not have an Apex portal-like solution and Smart VM where we do validation, this is of utmost importance. Another example is layers of text and bank logos appear when viewed in the proper software. So a vendor would typically provide a PDF or a TIFF image saying this is the ACH form, please update the bank account on your vendor master. The apexanalytix team did some forensic analysis on this document, and we found that there were layers and layers, up to actually 7 layers, in that PDF document where this particular imposter had reused this ACH form to potentially commit fraud with or potentially commit fraud multiple times earlier with different bank accounts that were opened fictitiously. So this PDF happened to have multiple layers of images, which you would not see in an ideal situation. And then a completely different bank account change request in the layers, right? So that was the superimposed image. So what this example says is it is almost impossible to manually look at every single bank account change request and be 100% sure that it is not a potential fraud scenario, right? It's just humanly impossible. And that's why from time to time, there would be incidents reported in a lot of variety of cases where there was potential fraud, right? And in some cases, actual money goes out. So how do we then prevent such things from happening again? So the way apexanalytix looks at the layers of protection is in two broad categories, and then which gets further divided into five. The two broad categories is who's making or requesting the change. Are they the authorized user, right? And then the change that they are requesting, is it genuine or not? Does it belong to the actual supplier or not, right? So those are the two broad categories. Now, if we go further deep inside these categories, it basically falls into one of these five layers of protection. So one is robust access controls. And what I mean by that is how are the suppliers logging in to an application like Apex Portal and making the request for the change? That's very, very important. In an email scenario, like Ken mentioned, there's practically no access control because any imposter could take over the supplier's email account or pretend to be originating from that supplier's email. That's called spoofing, and it could compromise your window master, right? So very important that how the change is being requested. If I just look at some industry statistics, according to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, the top sources of occupational fraud are check tampering and procurement fraud. So over the last 1.5 years, the FBI reported dramatic rise in fraud through spoofing. The examples are provided: phishing, business email compromise, and so on. And the problem has gotten worse during COVID-19 crisis as critical contacts are no longer in offices to receive callbacks to confirm bank account changes, right? So that's why we start with robust access controls. When we talk about access and user authentication, it's just not a simple username password. Along with those credentials, the suppliers must provide additional authentication measures like a one-time passcode, which gets authenticated through their work email address. We are tracking user behavior. So it's just not about, okay, you were authenticated successfully and therefore you can go in and make changes. No, we track user activity. We capture everything in the audit logs, and we track suspicious IPs or locations which are requesting the change. So if the supplier's in US and you're getting a change request from, let's say, Iran, well, that's a problem, right? So we take care of geolocating those IP addresses, the timing of the change, and from where the change was being requested. So that kind of falls into the user behavior monitoring as well, right? When we talk about frequency of these changes, so if the user logs in and makes changes multiple times for a bank account, we even have controls around how many times the bank account was being changed or requested to being changed, right? So we have those alerts built in, and if you log in and change the email address and then you change the bank account, we actually alert the old email address on file to prevent such fraud from happening as well. Now let's talk about bank account change controls, right? So let's assume that this person has been authenticated, they went through the multi-factor authentication, additional layer. They also succeeded in going through the pattern detection where we monitor user behavior, timing of the login, geolocation, IP address, and so on and so forth. But even then, we have more access controls like before you can enter a new bank account, you must enter the existing bank account on the record. So a typical imposter will not have that information, and therefore they won't will fail this authentication check, right? So it's all about layers and layers of protection, not one single control is the silver bullet, right? So old bank account is being requested, then uh, we make sure that no more than 2 bank account changes per month are being requested. And if the frequency increases, then we have an alert as well. Uh, Now, let's say this person logged in and went through all of these layers and ultimately changed the bank account. But we don't stop there. Once the bank account is changed, we actually do a real-time bank account ownership validation. So we have this feature built in for US, Sweden, Poland, India, and we are very soon introducing other countries in the world for this ownership validation. So in this case, we are able to validate if the account belongs to the bank, who's the owner on that bank account versus the name of the supplier in the Apex portal. We also validate whether it's an individual or a commercial bank account. Is there an overdraft on the account? What's the tax ID on the bank account versus the tax ID on the vendor master, and so on and so forth. So a very comprehensive account ownership validation is performed. And then lastly, for all countries in the world, globally, SmartVM has 55 million golden records that I mentioned earlier. What that means is a lot of these vendor records that we have also have bank account information that we may have previously validated, or uh, we have noticed that, let's say, 20 other clients of Apex is using the same vendor account and making payments to the supplier. How many payments have gone out to that supplier in the last 5 years or 10 years? So ultimately, how old is the bank account, right? So using a number of these attributes and the information that we have in SmartVM, we are able to predict the likelihood of the account holder uh, or likelihood of the account belonging to the supplier, right? So this bank account confidence score is also very important and works for all countries in the world. So those are the layers of protection I wanted to talk about to give you a perspective on how we can prevent such fraud from happening in future. So having said that, I'll open it up for Q&A. Also, you can see on the presentation, if you need more information, please fill out this poll question and also check on any boxes where you want to request more information, and we'll be happy to provide that to you and discuss that.
That sounds great. We're going to enter the Q&A portion of this webinar. If you haven't already submitted your question for Ken or Akhilesh, go ahead. Use that chat tool on your screen to submit them to me now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Ken, our first question from an attendee. They're curious if you had been experiencing an increase in attempted or successful BEC attacks before making the switch to the different portal.
So we had seen an increase in the number of attempts for fraud. Once we had a big one, we had a big one that went out the door in 2019, and that opened our eyes, and we buckled down, and now we have a lot of manual controls in place to try to validate and verify with the supplier by a different means than how we received the request to update that. So we are using the SmartVM outside of the portal today, and we have GUI-ACT that goes along with the portal to do those validations. But they are after the fact at the moment, but we do still have our manual controls in place up front until we go live with the portal in a few months. And then
Tell
it'll be
me,
automatic. It'll be up front. So
tell me, Akhilesh, is the experience that Ken is sharing isn't a surprise to you? Talk to me about what you're seeing with BEC attacks these days.
Sure. So BC attacks are very, very common, right? So with a lot of other checks and balances and the awareness that has followed in the industry, these imposters are typically switching from other means of spoofing or phishing to business email compromise. Because once you have compromised the supplier's network and taken over their email address, then it is very easy to first look at all the email history of that supplier, uh, learn from the correspondence, learn how the supplier operates, which clients they are communicating with, etc., and then use that gathered information to commit potential fraud, right? So BEC is basically uh, uh, the first choice of imposters or fraudsters in the industry today, right? So there's been a considerable increase, but fortunately, just like Ken is switching over to Apex for many other Apex clients who are already using Apex Pole in production or are in the process of implementing, they avoid this business email compromise situation because they can redirect all suppliers to go through the Apex portal and make the changes online. I talked about all the layers of protection, and therefore they can mitigate such fraud from happening in future.
Les, the next question is for you. One of our attendees wants to know the data from the supplier is validated in real time against what information? It almost sounds like a quiz show question there, right? So what are we validating this information against, Akhilesh?
Sure. So in the US, there is something called an early warning network, which is a association of the largest banks like JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, PNC, and so on and so forth, along with many participant banks in the US who have come together to create this network, and we connect to that network to validate information. So basically, through this network, Apex is able to get information like, does the account exist in this bank, and who's the owner of the account, what is the tax ID on the bank record, address information, and so on and so forth. So that's what we are validating against. And then once we do this real-time validation, we provide these results for the client's use so that they can use that information to either approve or reject the record, right? So instead of relying on that ACH form, which could be totally compromised, we rely on a more predictable and more trustworthy source of data, right? On top of that, I talked about the Apex Bank Pro likelihood score on how likely the account belongs to the supplier, and that's from our history of experience with that supplier, right? All the payments which have gone out in the past, how many clients are using that supplier. So using that information also, we can make an opinion saying, does the account belong to the supplier or not? So a combination of both the validation as well as the scoring helps a lot.
Akhilesh, another question for you. One of our attendees wants to know, can other forms be added to the online registration, such as an affidavit?
For sure. So from time to time, like out of box, there are 220,000 business rules pre-configured. And
How
that's what we
many?
do in the 220,000 business rules.
Holy mackerel.
Yeah, and this keeps growing. So we are really proud of our foundation. But on top of this, just like we are implementing the portal for Ken and AT&T, we work with our clients on what are the client-specific requirements. Like in your case, you want to capture an affidavit. So we will enforce that document rule in the document upload page and during the registration. The supplier could even e-sign it if the statutory requirements allow that for an affidavit. And we could also auto-generate the affidavit with things like name of the supplier, address of the supplier, and so on and so forth. So yeah, we have those features built in.
Ken, one of our attendees wants to know, is a manual phone call still required to the supplier upon banking change request?
Um,
And Ken, why don't you go first, and then I can add the technology piece to it.
Yeah, so today we will reach out by phone to contact the supplier, our contacts on record, if we don't have another means of contacting them to verify that the change request for the bank account is valid and that is correct. So phone call is just one method. Of course, once we get the portal, as Akhilesh can explain, we won't have to do that anymore because the supplier will update their bank and it gets validated real time. So Akhilesh, if you want to explain the other side of it.
Thanks, Ken. And yeah, like Ken mentioned, the goal is to fully automate such changes, including bank account changes. So let's say the validation passes and there are no issues. We even have a auto approve process, for example, where clients could decide, look, if all of the conditions are good and it's validated, then we don't need to call back the suppliers and we can either manually review approve or auto approve it, right? But subsequent to that, let's say there are exceptions. The bank account validation failed because we are saying the account does not belong to the supplier. So now that's a red flag. And that's a piece of information now you can use to either reject the change, or you could now make the call to the supplier, or the business team member who's working with that supplier could make the call and say, look, we received this change through the portal. It got rejected because it appears you're not the owner of the account. So what's up, right? So that's a whole different conversation than should I trust that you made the change, right? So you have information to use when you make that call now with the Apex portal.
Akhilesh, this is a big change for AP leaders. I mean, over the past several years, we've been drilling in everybody's head, right? You got to make the call, got to make the call. And now you're saying, well, that's not necessarily the case. Talk to me about that. Does that a shock to a lot of the systems of the AP folks that you talk to?
Yeah, so one, it's a huge differentiator
Yeah.
for and basically, whenever I talk about it, I'm excited to talk about it because it changes the lives of our customers and their suppliers, because now it's more efficient. And this, from a supplier's perspective, also, it's a big win because I mean, if the money goes to a wrong account, not only as a client you're concerned, but I mean, the supplier did not get the money. They are even more worried about their bank account changes. And if the suppliers learn that you as a client have a very robust process on such changes, they would love to use the system as well.
Ken, Rosanna wants to know more about what differentiated Apex from the other companies you looked at.
Good question. So the number one, it's the infrastructure of Apex. So all of those 800 plus databases they use, that is unique to Apex from the ones that I interviewed and had demos from. Number two, validating the bank account. Using that service with their smart VM is also unique with to the ones that I interviewed. And I'll be honest, one of our banks, they have a similar process, but that would involve yet another system and another call and another entire mechanical process where it's all built into the portal. So those are the two biggest. The bank account validation, they're basically the smart VM product, right? And the real-time compliance are the two biggest items that just made it a no-brainer for me to choose Apex.
And a question from Benj. He wants to know, do you have all suppliers connected to the portal for bank updates, or are there suppliers that you're still manually handling, i.e., this is his or it's not mine? Are all suppliers forced to use this portal to do business with AT&T? So how would you respond to all that?
Okay, so first is my portal isn't live yet. I have another 4 or 5 months, right, for that to happen. But the plan is to have all suppliers except taxing authorities. Taxing authorities will be entered into the portal by proxy from my tax department, all regular suppliers will have to use the portal in order to do business with AT&T. Yes.
Is that best practice, Akhilesh?
That surely is. The best practice is get the information from the source of the information directly using encrypted form of communication, which Apex Portal allows, right? Instead of emails or Excel files or Word forms and so on and so forth, right? So that's the best practice. And second is, like Ken mentioned, not all suppliers will log in, like tax authorities. You'll have other government vendors, utility vendors, board of directors. So those are exceptions, but outside of these exceptions, you should have 100% of the suppliers log in. And guess what? Through this service, your suppliers are not getting charged to log in and register. So it's completely free to the supplier network.
I have a related question here, Akhilesh. Matt is wondering, so what kind of supplier adoption do you get for this sort of a tool?
Sure. I'll speak from a variety of other clients who have implemented the Apex Portal. So because of this mandate that if you need to make a bank account change or any change whatsoever, you need to log into Apex Portal. So this increases the supplier adoption just after a few months of implementation to almost like 80 to 90%, right? And then why it's not 100% is because there's always a churn of suppliers with various clients, like suppliers get deactivated, new suppliers get added, et cetera, et cetera. So there would be a portion of the suppliers who don't have open invoices, they are not making a change, et cetera. So those records may remain stagnant because of no activity, but outside of that, it's the coverage is really good.
And a question for you. Thomas wants to know, has this more rigorous fraud process increased unapplied payments? And if so, is it fully manual, or have you found a way to automate a portion of that effort? Now, I understand your portal is not live yet, but let's talk about that. What do you anticipate?
So I don't anticipate a problem with unapplied payments, and here's why. Because along with the portal is the inquiry module. So all of the invoices and payments made out of my ERP system will be visible to the supplier in the portal. So using their inquiry module, so they can look to see exactly what that payment is for right from the portal itself. In addition, AT&T also sends out for the majority of our suppliers an email with that remittance information as well. So I don't anticipate a problem.
So Akhilesh, Thomas is nervous about unapplied payments. Put him at ease.
Sure. And yeah, like Ken mentioned, those payments are going to be visible. But Apex kind of also offers a related service, which is our audit and recovery service, where we actually do a statement audit with suppliers based on that inquiry module information. And we can find actually the opposite. We can find unapplied credits in the client's ERPs and actually recover on your behalf too. So it's giving more information to the supplier, saying here are all your payments, but also reconciling it and saying here are unapplied credits, which the clients can take advantage of.
Akhilesh, Lois writes, currently we are manually inputting all of our vendors. That's music to your ears, I know, Akhilesh, but nonetheless, I'll plow ahead. She writes, we are using the IRS TIN matching system for first and second line of the W-9. We print out the TIN match to use to review for the vendor review. Does your system provide TIN access and matching?
Exactly. This is like the basics. It's built into our system. So as the suppliers are registering, they enter the TIN number. We validate in real time with IRS. So everything that you do manually today is automated in seconds. But not only just the TIN match, but we do address validation. So the address which gets printed on the W-9 is validated as well. We verify if it is truly an LLC with the Secretary of State office. So we make sure the business entity type is correct. and so on and so forth. So we actually auto-generate the W-9, and during the end of the registration, the vendor literally sees a auto-generated W-9. They can review it, e-sign it, and move on. It takes like less than 5 seconds.
Diane wants to know, is Apex using GAC EWS for both vendor supplier verification and bank account verification?
Yeah, so we don't rely upon GAIAC, although if you have an existing subscription, we can reuse it in the Apex portal. But we directly connect to EWS using one of the large banks, and that's how we integrate. But on top of this EWS validation for US, we also have a service that we connect to for Poland, Sweden, and India. And then on top of that, we also complement it with our bank account confidence score, which is on a global basis.
Daniel writes, once vendor record is created after validation, is the validation continuously running against all records to identify when or if a tax ID change or bank account change occurs, or if it's no longer valid?
Yeah, sure. So that's the beauty of the Apex portal with SmartVM. So Apex portal triggers the validation when someone logs in and makes a change. So that's the trigger point. But what SmartVM subscription does is now you get that continuous monitoring aspect of it enabled with the registration module, right? So if the vendor is on a prohibited list, or if their TIN number is no longer valid, etc., you'll get those alerts from SmartVM.
Question from Mary Akhilesh. She writes, what are you validating the vendor information against? EIN, address, etc. I think this is a familiar question, but nonetheless.
Sure. So we validate it against the official repositories of that information. So if it is a US tax ID, it is always irs.gov. If it is, let's say, a Germany VAT number, we'll go to the EU VAT authority and validate it. Same for the India PAN and so on and so forth. So for tax IDs, we'll connect globally with different countries' local tax authorities, and we'll validate it. Same with address. For address information, we'll go to USPS in the US, or the Canadian Post in Canada, and local postal authorities in each country, right? And same way for diversity information, we connect to more than 100 different data sources like sba.gov, which is more federal agency, but we also connect to different states and counties and city databases for diversity and minority certification with women-owned businesses, etc. And we validate that. So on this slide, you can see 850 plus external sources. Those are the official government sources, tax authorities, and that list keeps growing every day.
All right, a related question from Jeff. He writes, can I conclude that the strength of the Apex portal is dependent on the number of companies that have a subscription to the portal? And if that's the case, how many companies today are connected?
So yeah, the strength of Apex Portal is not dependent on the number of clients. Reason being, it's a difference between Apex Portal and SmartVM, right? So Apex Portal, the architecture is 220,000 business rules built in, and then we implement client-specific rules using a rules engine, and then we implement it. So it's your portal, it works for you, it's with your branding and your supplier's user experiences with your client's company's logo, right? SmartVM, on the other hand, grows independently of Apex Portal. It grows with Apex Portal, but also independently. So think about SmartVM as a global repository of all suppliers in the world. We have 55 million suppliers and growing. So yes, the information that we get from Apex Portal eventually gets validated through SmartVM as part of that golden record. But then Apex has Apex audit and recovery services, where we have global Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies. We do reach out to millions of suppliers using phone calls, emails, physical letters. So we have millions of interactions with suppliers globally using our recovery and audit services. That also makes it part of the SmartVM database, right? So yes, a number of portals help SmartVM to grow, but also our recovery services and the independent interactions help SmartVM grow. and then the 850 external sources. So we are not dependent on one piece of information, but a variety of information.
Another question from Lois. This time she writes, we don't store any banking information. We're using third-party payment processors to manage our payments. So how does your system get at our banking information for our suppliers?
Yeah, sure. So we have a couple of clients who do that as well. One of the clients uses Bank of America Pay Mode, for example. We were able to incorporate that rule set within the Apex portal. So some suppliers who are using that method of payment, we will not capture that bank account information. But we can still validate tax IDs, addresses, and all the other validations that we are doing, minus that bank account, right? Now, if the client chooses to provide us with that bank account information from the third party, then yes, we can still validate it.
Joanne wants to know, will insurance carriers for fraud crime policies still require phone calls to suppliers for verification for bank charges in order to continue our coverage?
Yeah, I don't have specifics on that, but based on our experience working with other Fortune 500,000 clients, I know for sure clients are no longer doing callbacks 100% of the time if the validation checks out to be good. So my assumption is no phone calls are required, but since it's a legal question, I'll defer it to a legal team for an accurate answer.
Ken, one of our attendees who goes by the handle A Pool, wants to know, how much time do you reckon this is going to save your AP processors?
So it's going to save our business units approximately an hour worth of time for them to gather the information and enter it into our web tool. It's also going to save my team. I have a team of about 15 that handle the manual part of it today, plus additional support people. And it's gonna save all of their time. They'll all be repurposed into different roles. I will
Raquel,
only need a small team to handle the tax ones by proxy. So
Raquel wants to know, Akhilesh, what does the implementation time for this solution look like? Weeks, months, a year?
Yeah, so it varies, but short answer is, let's say the inquiry module, that's the fastest to implement. It generally takes, like, if you have one ERP in one region to implement, let's say North America, it's anywhere between 1 month to 3 months, depending on how fast you can deliver the data to Apex, right? So there's some dependency on your side, but we can work at your pace. Registration module, a typical implementation time is 6 months to 9 months for one ERP in one region. But again, based on complexity, how many workflows do you have? How many fields are you capturing which are specific to you, even outside what Apex has built in? Then the time could be extended, right? So Ken mentioned for AT&T, it's highly complex, covering their global business rules. So it's definitely longer for Ken and AT&T, but it varies. So Ken, maybe you can also share your viewpoint on this.
yeah, so like Akhilesh was alluding, so the AT&T is very complex. I have 115-ish legal entities, one major ERP system and one small one. I'm global. There's a lot of complexities with our corporate real estate as well as our global supply chains and approvals and workflows. A lot of specific requirements, additional data, almost 300 additional data elements just for those two business units. So plus we're doing the risk module, the discovery module, the inquiry module, as well as registration. So it's very complex from our side. So it's taking us, let's just say from start to finish, we're about a year and a half. So if that tells you how complex we are. to do it. We could have done it a little simpler, if you will, if we didn't have all these requirements. But we're very complex. So
Akhilesh, Pamela writes, some of the systems like this that I've looked at require a small bank deposit to validate bank accounts. Does Apex require that?
We don't. We are able to validate using the source of the information, meaning literally, if the supplier has, let's say, hypothetically, a bank account in Wells Fargo, we are really connecting to Wells Fargo and saying, do you have this account and does it belong to the supplier, right? So because of that kind of validation, we don't need that penny test, if you will. But yes, clients who don't have access to such features would rely on a penny test. But all you're getting with a penny test is, yes, that account exists and you can send the money to it, but the account may have been opened by an imposter or a fraudster, and the penny test will still succeed, right? So the penny test is useful to avoid returns of payments or maybe a typo while entering the data, but the penny test is not good to prevent fraud at all.
Akhilesh, another question from you. Jeremy writes, is adding government tax bodies in countries outside the US automated? The CRA in Canada, for example.
Yes, it's 100% automated. So for Canada, we validate the QST, GST, HST number. Similarly, for all of Europe, we validate VAT numbers. We had a Brexit where UK, came out of the EU, and then we connected to UK tax authority directly. So we do that for many countries in the world.
Nancy wants to know, what type of encrypted information exchange does Apex Portal allow?
Sure. So all data that we exchange with our clients or with our your suppliers is encrypted. So data at rest and data in transit is 100% encrypted. But examples of sensitive data that we exchange is tax IDs, addresses, bank account numbers, email addresses, and so on and so forth.
Sally wants to know, how easy is it to register as a supplier? Now, I'm going to direct this question to you, Ken, because I imagine I know what Akhilesh is going to say.
okay, so it's fairly straightforward. So my business units will log into the portal, make sure that the supplier doesn't exist. So you realize there's between my ERP, where the vendor master resides, as well as Apex, it's a real-time API. So they log into the portal, they see if that vendor exists, right? If it doesn't, they, based on the vendor type, it's all automated. They request an email basically to be sent to the supplier. So they got to put in the contact information, right? We make them default terms. We've defaulted them based on type, but they can change terms, which will have to be approved later if they're different than the default. The invite goes to the supplier. The supplier then enters in their legal name, doing business as name, their tax ID, their address, and if they choose for like an electronic payment, they need to enter their bank account information, and all gets validated in real time. And then once that's complete, it automatically routes to the business unit to review and approve. If it's a generic vendor, and I say not specific to one of those business units, then it comes to my team to review and approve, and that's it. I mean, it's really, there's not, global supply chain and corporate real estate require additional data fields that's entered in, or it's captured along the way. So we want to know the vendor parent, or the child parent relationship with the vendors. We want to know the minority information. That all comes in from Apex. Apex does all of that, and it gets attached during the process, and it comes into my ERP system. So it's really fairly simple. There's really nothing very complex about it for the supplier or for the person at AT&T requesting that supplier be set up.
I'm up against it, boys. Let's try and plow through a couple of these questions in the time we have remaining. So real quick, Akhilesh, Amanda wants to know, have you integrated with Oracle before?
Yes, a lot of our clients, in fact, use Oracle and including Oracle Fusion. So yeah, we got a variety of experience doing that.
I use
Brian,
Oracle as well.
Brian wants to know, can Apex Portal work without Smart VM?
So Smart VM is built in, a portion of Smart VM is built into Apex Portal. But you can buy additional Smart VM subscription, which allows you to do the following. One is pre-populate the information. So if you invite a new supplier who doesn't exist in your vendor master, then that supplier's golden record gets pre-populated. So the supplier has to do a lot less typing. So that's one advantage of Smart VM subscription. Then you get that continuous monitoring, where if the supplier's information change without them logging into the Apex portal, you still get those alerts. So those are two significant advantages of bundling Smart VM with Apex portal.
Javier wants to know whether you can integrate with Coupa, yes or no?
Yes, a short answer is yes. Obviously, we'll need to discuss what are you trying to integrate, etc. But yes, we have clients using Coupa with Apex and their ERP systems.
Javier didn't ask for details. He just asked for a yes or no question, or at least that was my interpretation. Listen, guys, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Akhilesh and Ken, for an excellent presentation and for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to join us.